In the fall of 2003 at Abu Ghraib prison outside Baghdad, U.S. soldiers took photographs of Iraqi detainees forced into naked human pyramids, hooded with wires attached to their hands simulating electrocution, and subjected to sexual humiliation and other abuses, images that leaked in April 2004 and triggered global outrage. Yet the Bush administration and Pentagon initially portrayed the incidents as the work of a few rogue soldiers, while declassified reports, including the Taguba investigation, revealed systemic failures, confused chains of command, and policy pressures that demanded a deeper examination of accountability in wartime detention operations. Abu Ghraib prison, located about 20 miles west of Baghdad, was a notorious facility under Saddam Hussein's regime that the U.S. military repurposed after the 2003 invasion. By the fall of 2003, it held thousands of Iraqi detainees, many swept up during counterinsurgency operations as the post-invasion security situation deteriorated rapidly. The prison was operated by the U.S. Army's 800th Military Police Brigade, a reserve unit primarily tasked with detainee custody. The official version presented by the Pentagon in the first days after the photographs became public in late April 2004 described the abuses as isolated criminal acts by a small group of low-ranking soldiers. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and other officials emphasized that these were the actions of a few bad apples who had violated military regulations and basic standards of conduct. The narrative stressed that the incidents did not represent U.S. policy and that the military was committed to investigating and punishing those responsible. On April 28, 2004, the CBS program 60 Minutes 2 broadcast some of the most disturbing images. The photos showed detainees stacked in naked human pyramids, forced to masturbate in front of female soldiers, leashed like animals, and hooded with electrical wires attached to their bodies. Additional images depicted soldiers smiling and giving thumbs up next to the humiliated prisoners. The visual evidence spread rapidly across global media, sparking widespread condemnation and damaging America's standing in the Muslim world and beyond. The Bush administration moved quickly to contain the damage. President George W. Bush expressed disgust and stated that the actions did not reflect the values of the United States. Military spokesmen promised full investigations and prosecutions. The initial focus was placed squarely on the enlisted personnel visible in the photographs, particularly Specialist Charles Granner and Private First Class Lindy England, who became the public faces of the scandal. In the weeks following the leak, the Army announced administrative and criminal actions against a number of soldiers from the 372nd Military Police Company. The dominant public message remained that these were aberrant acts by poorly supervised individuals operating in difficult conditions, not the result of higher policy or systemic problems. This framing shaped early congressional briefings and media coverage. The prison itself, however, had been operating under extreme strain. After the fall of Baghdad, Abu Ghraib became a central detention facility for thousands of Iraqis, including suspected insurgents, common criminals, and many who were simply rounded up in sweeps. Overcrowding was severe, living conditions were poor, and the facility was frequently attacked by mortars and insurgents. The 800th MP Brigade was under-resourced and tasked with responsibilities far beyond its original training. This was the version that dominated the initial official response: deplorable but isolated criminal behavior that would be addressed through the military justice system. Yet even as the Pentagon emphasized individual responsibility, internal military investigations already underway were documenting a more complicated picture involving command failures, intelligence priorities, and the migration of aggressive interrogation techniques from other theaters. The broader context for what happened at Abu Ghraib was the rapidly deteriorating situation in Iraq following the U.S.-led invasion of March 2003. After the fall of Baghdad in April, coalition forces faced a growing insurgency that caught many planners by surprise. As attacks on U.S. and coalition troops increased through the summer and fall, the military responded with large-scale detention operations. Thousands of Iraqi men, many of military age, were rounded up in cordon and search missions, often with limited intelligence to distinguish between insurgents, criminals, and innocent civilians. Abu Ghraib became one of the main collection points for these detainees. Originally a large prison complex under Saddam Hussein, the facility was hastily repurposed. By October 2003, it held well over 6,000 prisoners in conditions that were severely overcrowded and inadequate. The prison suffered from chronic shortages of food, water, medical supplies, and sanitation. It was also located in a high-risk area and came under frequent mortar attacks from insurgents outside the walls, adding to the constant tension inside. The unit responsible for day-to-day operations was the 800th Military Police Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Janis Karpinski. This was a reserve unit drawn largely from the United States, with many soldiers having little prior experience in combat zone detention operations. The brigade was responsible for managing multiple detention facilities across Iraq, but was chronically understaffed and under-equipped for the scale of the mission. Many MPs worked 12 to 16-hour shifts in an environment of extreme heat, dust, and threat. Meanwhile, pressure for actionable intelligence mounted. As the insurgency intensified after the summer of 2003, military intelligence officers and contractors at Abu Ghraib pushed hard for information on insurgent networks, bomb makers, and foreign fighters. A separate chain of command for interrogation operations, involving military intelligence personnel and civilian contractors, operated alongside the military police. This dual structure created confusion over who was in charge of detainees once they entered the facility. Military police were responsible for custody and basic security, while intelligence teams controlled access for questioning. The broader policy environment added another layer. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, the U.S. government had authorized more aggressive interrogation approaches at Guantanamo Bay and in Afghanistan. Some of these techniques, including stress positions, sleep deprivation, and the use of dogs, began to migrate to Iraq. Internal military memos and investigations would later document how the distinction between permitted and prohibited methods became blurred in the field. In this atmosphere of operational strain, resource shortages, and intense demand for intelligence, Abu Ghraib functioned as a pressure cooker. The combination of inexperienced guards, unclear command relationships, frequent attacks on the facility, and relentless pressure from higher headquarters to produce results created conditions in which abuse became not only possible but, according to later reports, predictable. The official emphasis at the time remained on the challenges of managing a large detainee population in a war zone. Yet the internal record already contained warnings about deteriorating discipline and leadership issues within the 800th MP Brigade that were not effectively addressed before the worst abuses occurred between October and December 2003. The mechanisms that enabled the abuses at Abu Ghraib involved overlapping and often confused chains of command between military police and military intelligence personnel. The 800th Military Police Brigade under Brigadier General Janis Karpinski held formal responsibility for detainee custody and facility security. However, interrogation operations fell under a separate military intelligence chain that reported through different channels. This dual structure created significant friction. MPs were expected to support intelligence gathering by preparing detainees for questioning, but the precise boundaries of authority, who controlled detainee conditions, sleep schedules, and access, remained poorly defined in practice. Investigations later documented how aggressive interrogation techniques originally developed at Guantanamo Bay and in Afghanistan migrated to Iraq. In August 2003, Major General Jeffrey Miller, commander of the detention operation at Guantanamo, visited Iraq and recommended applying similar methods to increase intelligence yield. His suggestions included the use of military working dogs, stress positions, isolation, and other enhanced approaches. These ideas influenced policies at Abu Ghraib, where military intelligence officers and civilian contractors pushed for harsher treatment to break detainees perceived as high-value targets. Leadership failures compounded the problem. The Taguba Report, completed in February 2004, found that Brigadier General Karpinski exercised poor oversight of the 800th MP Brigade. Training for the reserve MPs was inadequate for the demands of a combat zone prison. Many soldiers had received little instruction on the Geneva Conventions or proper detainee handling. Discipline eroded under the stress of constant mortar attacks, extreme heat, and chronic understaffing. Higher headquarters failed to correct known deficiencies despite earlier warnings about conditions at Abu Ghraib. At the same time, intelligence officers operated with considerable autonomy in the hard site section of the prison where many of the worst abuses occurred. Detainees designated for interrogation were often held in isolation or subjected to conditions that MPs were ordered to facilitate. The pressure to produce intelligence on the growing insurgency created an environment in which softening up detainees became normalized. Some soldiers later testified that they received verbal instructions from intelligence personnel to rough up prisoners or strip them as part of preparation for questioning. The broader policy climate in Washington contributed to the ambiguity. After 9/11, legal memos from the Justice Department had sought to narrow the definition of torture and expand permissible interrogation methods for unlawful combatants. While these memos were not written specifically for Abu Ghraib, they helped shape an atmosphere in which traditional restraints on detainee treatment were loosened. The exact transmission of these policy shifts to the field remained a point of contention in later reviews. The result was a system in which responsibility was fragmented. Military police felt pressured to assist intelligence efforts. Intelligence personnel operated with limited accountability for day-to-day detainee welfare. Senior commanders focused on the larger counterinsurgency campaign did not maintain close enough supervision of conditions on the ground. This combination of structural confusion, policy migration, and leadership shortcomings created the conditions in which the documented abuses flourished between October and December 2003. These mechanisms would only become fully visible once formal investigations began in earnest after the photographs reached the public. The specific abuses at Abu Ghraib documented in photographs and subsequent investigations went far beyond isolated incidents of misconduct. Between October and December 2003, detainees were subjected to systematic humiliation and physical mistreatment, particularly in the prison's hard site area used for high-value interrogations. The most widely circulated images showed naked Iraqi men stacked in human pyramids, forced to simulate sexual acts and positioned in stress positions with hoods over their heads. In one notorious photograph, a detainee stood on a box with a hood covering his head and wires attached to his hands, told that he would be electrocuted if he stepped down. Other images captured detainees being dragged on leashes, attacked by military working dogs, and forced to stand for extended periods with bags over their heads. Some prisoners were kept naked for days, deprived of sleep, and subjected to loud music or extreme temperatures as part of conditioning for interrogation. Detainee testimonies collected during investigations described beatings, threats of rape, and sexual humiliation involving female soldiers. Medical records in the Taguba Report confirmed numerous cases of physical injury consistent with these accounts. The photographs themselves were taken by soldiers from the 372nd Military Police Company, many of whom appeared smiling or giving thumbs-up signs next to the abused detainees. These images, numbering in the hundreds according to investigators, were shared among unit members via computer files and personal cameras. Their existence provided irrefutable visual evidence that distinguished this case from earlier, less documented allegations of mistreatment in Iraq. The Taguba Report, an internal army investigation led by Major General Antonio Taguba, described the abuses as sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. It documented at least 27 specific incidents involving multiple detainees, including forced nudity, forced masturbation in front of others, and the use of dogs to intimidate prisoners. The report noted that some abuses appeared intended to intimidate or extract information, while others seemed motivated by personal amusement or a breakdown in discipline. Not all detainees were subjected to these treatments, but the pattern was concentrated among those held for intelligence purposes. Many of the victims were low-level suspects or individuals picked up in sweeps with little or no intelligence value. The scale of the facility, thousands of prisoners, meant that only a fraction of cases were captured in photographs, raising questions about how many additional incidents went undocumented. These details emerged clearly once the images leaked. The visual record forced a level of scrutiny that earlier internal complaints and Red Cross reports had not achieved. The contrast between the smiling faces of the soldiers and the suffering of the detainees became a powerful symbol of dehumanization in wartime. The documented acts were not limited to a single night or a single guard. They reflected a period of months in which abusive practices became normalized within parts of the facility. The leak of the photographs in April 2004 forced the scandal into the open and triggered an immediate crisis response from the Pentagon and the White House. In late April, CBS News' 60 Minutes 2 program aired a segment featuring some of the most disturbing images from Abu Ghraib. The broadcast, followed quickly by publication of additional photos in outlets such as The New Yorker, ignited international condemnation. Within days, the visual evidence of abuse spread across global media, becoming a major diplomatic and public relations disaster for the United States and the Muslim world and beyond. The Pentagon's initial reaction was to emphasize individual responsibility. Senior officials, including Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, described the incidents as the criminal acts of a small number of soldiers who had failed to uphold military standards. President Bush publicly expressed disgust at the images and stated that the behavior did not represent American values. Military spokesmen promised swift investigations and prosecutions while attempting to contain the story to the actions of low-ranking personnel. Behind the scenes, the Army had already begun internal inquiries. Major General Antonio Taguba had been appointed in January 2004 to investigate the 800th MP Brigade following earlier complaints and a Red Cross report documenting serious issues at Abu Ghraib. His report, completed in February 2004 but not yet public, was far more critical than the initial public statements suggested. As the photographs leaked, pressure mounted for greater transparency. Congressional hearings began in May 2004. Secretary Rumsfeld testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, acknowledging that the events were unacceptable, but continuing to frame them primarily as failures at the lowest levels. The administration resisted calls for an independent commission, preferring to handle the matter through existing military justice channels. Several soldiers from the 372nd MP Company, including Charles Granner and Lindy England, were quickly identified as central figures in the photographs and faced criminal charges. The leak itself originated from within the military. Specialist Joseph Darby, a member of the 372nd MP Company, had received a CD containing the images from another soldier. Disturbed by what he saw, Darby turned the materials over to investigators. His decision to come forward provided the crucial evidence that propelled the case forward, though it later made him a target for retaliation within his unit. The immediate response combined damage control with limited accountability. The military launched multiple overlapping investigations, including the Faye Jones Report on the role of military intelligence. Public statements continued to stress that the abuses were aberrations rather than policy. Yet the sheer volume and graphic nature of the photographs made the few bad apples explanation increasingly difficult to sustain as more details from internal reports began to surface. This phase marked the shift from a contained internal problem to a major public scandal. The images compelled a level of scrutiny and international pressure that earlier warnings and Red Cross reports had failed to generate. The mechanisms of response, public statements focused on individual guilt, internal military inquiries, and congressional oversight, would shape the official handling of the scandal in the months that followed. Formal inquiries into the abuses at Abu Ghraib produced a series of internal military reports that documented both the scale of the misconduct and significant shortcomings in leadership and oversight. The most important of these was the Taguba Report, formerly titled AR-15-6 Investigation of the 800th Military Police Brigade, completed in late February 2004 by Major General Antonio Taguba. The report described the abuses as sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses, and found that numerous soldiers from the 372nd MP Company had engaged in cruel and humiliating treatment of detainees. The Taguba investigation concluded that the 800th MP Brigade suffered from serious leadership failures. Brigadier General Janis Karpinski was criticized for inadequate supervision and a lack of command presence at Abu Ghraib. The report highlighted systemic problems including poor training, insufficient staffing, and a breakdown in discipline under harsh conditions. It also documented how military intelligence personnel and civilian contractors exerted influence over detainee conditions in ways that blurred the lines between custody and interrogation. Subsequent reviews expanded on these findings. The Faye Jones Report examined the role of military intelligence and concluded that some intelligence personnel had requested or encouraged abusive practices to prepare detainees for questioning. The independent Schlesinger panel appointed by Secretary Rumsfeld acknowledged broader policy and command issues across U.S. detention operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. These reports, though partially redacted when eventually released, provided a detailed internal record of what had gone wrong. In the military justice system, several soldiers faced court-martial. Specialist Charles Granner, widely seen as a central figure in the abuses, was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Private First Class Lindy England, whose image appeared in many of the photographs, was convicted of conspiracy and maltreatment and received a 3-year sentence. A total of 11 soldiers from the 372nd MP Company were convicted or received administrative punishment. No officers above the rank of captain were convicted of criminal charges related to the detainee abuse itself. Congressional hearings in May and September 2004 featured testimony from Secretary Rumsfeld, senior generals, and some of the soldiers involved. The hearings exposed gaps in oversight but produced no major legislative reforms or high-level resignations beyond those already anticipated. The administration maintained that the investigations demonstrated the system's ability to self-correct. Critics argued that the focus on low-ranking enlisted personnel shielded higher command from full accountability. The formal inquiries confirmed the reality of the abuses through photographic evidence, detainee statements, and soldier testimony. They also exposed how ambiguous rules of engagement for detention operations, combined with intense pressure for intelligence, contributed to the breakdown. However, the investigation stopped short of establishing a direct policy of torture originating from the highest levels of the Pentagon or White House. The record showed failures of supervision and policy implementation more clearly than it proved deliberate orchestration from above. These official reviews brought some measure of accountability for those directly involved in the photographed acts, but they also highlighted the limits of internal military processes when examining broader systemic and command issues. The human consequences of the abuses at Abu Ghraib extended far beyond the prison walls and lasted for years. For the Iraqi detainees subjected to the documented mistreatment, the impact was profound and lasting. Many suffered physical injuries, including broken bones, dog bites, and long-term effects from stress positions and beatings. Psychological trauma was even more widespread. Detainees reported humiliation, loss of dignity, and deep distrust of American forces. For those later released without charge, often individuals swept up in broad security operations, the experience became a personal and family scar that fueled resentment toward the occupation. Among the U.S. soldiers directly involved, the outcomes varied sharply. Several low-ranking members of the 372nd MP Company faced courts-martial imprisonment and dishonorable discharges. Charles Granner received a 10-year sentence and Lindy England served 3 years. Many others received administrative punishments or saw their military careers end. Some soldiers who refused to participate or later spoke out, such as Specialist Joseph Darby, faced threats and social ostracism within their units. The broader 800th MP Brigade carried the stigma of the scandal, even though the majority of its personnel were not directly implicated in the photographed abuses. For Iraqi public opinion, Abu Ghraib became a powerful symbol of American hypocrisy and brutality. The images circulated widely in Iraq and across the Arab world, reinforcing narratives of occupation and disrespect for Muslim dignity. Insurgent groups exploited the scandal in propaganda, using it as a recruiting tool. The damage to U.S. credibility in Iraq was significant and contributed to increased hostility toward coalition forces during a critical period of the insurgency. Internationally, the scandal severely harmed America's global standing. Allies expressed dismay, while adversaries used the photographs to criticize U.S. human rights rhetoric. The International Committee of the Red Cross and human rights organizations had issued earlier warnings that received limited attention. The public release of the images validated many of those concerns. In the Muslim world, the scandal inflamed anti-American sentiment and complicated diplomatic efforts in the Middle East for years afterward. The families of the soldiers involved also paid a price. Some faced harassment or public shaming when the identities of those in the photographs became known. On the American home front, the revelations deepened divisions over the Iraq War. For many who had supported the invasion on the premise of liberating Iraq from tyranny, the images raised uncomfortable questions about the conduct of U.S. forces and the nature of the occupation. The long-term human ledger included damaged lives on all sides, traumatized detainees, convicted soldiers, eroded public trust in Iraq, and a blow to American moral authority abroad. While reparations or formal apologies to individual detainees were limited, the scandal contributed to broader policy reviews of detention practices, though the full human cost, measured in broken bodies, minds, and relationships, remains difficult to quantify. The available evidence on Abu Ghraib rests primarily on contemporaneous primary sources: the Taguba Report, the Fay-Jones Report, the Schlesinger Panel findings, court-martial records, photographic evidence, detainee statements, and declassified Department of Defense documents. These records confirm that serious abuses, including forced nudity, sexual humiliation, physical assaults, and use of dogs for intimidation and stress positions, occurred at the prison between October and December 2003. The photographs provide irrefutable visual documentation of many of these acts. Multiple investigations established leadership failures, inadequate training, and command confusion between the military police and military intelligence chains. What remains contested is the precise degree to which higher-level policy directly caused or encouraged the worst abuses. The official reports documented the migration of aggressive interrogation techniques from Guantanamo and Afghanistan, but they did not establish a clear paper trail of orders for the specific sadistic acts captured in the photographs. Historians and legal scholars continue to debate how far responsibility extended beyond the soldiers visible in the images. The available documents do not fully resolve questions about the knowledge and involvement of senior commanders or the exact influence of post-9/11 legal interpretations on field behavior. Evaluating these events requires acknowledging the wartime context of 2003 Iraq. The country was descending into insurgency, intelligence demands were intense, and U.S. forces operated in an environment of fear and uncertainty. Applying peacetime human rights standards to detention operations in a combat zone carries inherent challenges. At the same time, the primary sources make clear that many of the documented acts violated military regulations and the Geneva Conventions regardless of broader policy debates. In the end, the heaviest price was paid by the Iraqi detainees who suffered humiliation and trauma, many of whom were later released without charge. Low-ranking soldiers, particularly from the 372nd MP Company, faced courts-martial, prison time, and ruined careers. The American public and military's reputation suffered lasting damage, especially in the Arab world. Brigadier General Janis Karpinski was demoted but not criminally charged. No high-ranking officers or senior civilian officials faced significant personal consequences for the systemic failures documented in the report. Some things changed. The scandal prompted reviews of detention policies, greater emphasis on training, and eventual closure of Abu Ghraib as a U.S. facility. It contributed to broader debates about interrogation practices and led to tighter oversight in some areas. What did not change was the recurring difficulty of maintaining accountability when intelligence pressure, poor command structures, and wartime stress converge in distant prisons. The images remain a permanent part of the historical record of the Iraq War, a stark reminder of how quickly discipline can erode and how difficult it is to contain the human cost once it does. The declassified files and photographs preserve both the scale of the failure and the limits of the accountability that followed. They stand as a documented case study in the gap between stated American values and the realities of occupation, and in the enduring tension between security demands and the rules meant to constrain power even in war.